Hey guys, Aaron here. Today we're going to be replacing the valve cover and valve cover gasket on a Nissan Titan. Now these steps and procedures will work from years 2004 to 2015. Now on this particular truck is a 2004 with about 230,000 miles. We're getting a leak on the driver's side, so that's the side we're going to be tackling. If you're going to be doing the passenger side, it's pretty much the same. I'll go ahead and throw a link in the description for the parts where you can get. Now if you look, we actually have ignition coils that go through the valve cover itself. And there's little grommets that sit in the valve cover that seal the spark plug tube, and so oil doesn't get in there. Those seals are not serviceable, so we're going to go ahead and replace the valve covers as well. I'll go ahead and throw a link in the description for those valve covers. They're not too much. They're only about $50, and that's coming directly from Nissan. So before we begin, let's go ahead and go over the parts and tools we're going to need to get the job done. So we'll need some needle nose pliers, a 10mm socket, some brake clean or some carb cleaner. Degreaser works as well. Then I also like to use the Right Stuff black silicone gasket maker. It's really good stuff. I'll put a link in the description for this where you can buy it. Rag, you need a razor, and then we're also going to need a ratchet. I'm going to be using my power ratchet. It's quick and fast, makes the job go by very quickly. I'll go ahead and throw a link in the description too if you're interested in purchasing one of those. And of course we're going to need a new valve cover and new valve cover gasket. I like to use OEM stuff when working on these Nissans. I found a pretty good source online on Amazon where you can buy these for a really good price. Make sure to check a link in the description for these parts, and let's go ahead and get started with it. First step we're going to do is just actually remove the negative post off of the battery. That way no one turns on the ignition when we have anything unplugged, or even worse, tries to start the vehicle with the valve cover open. Now this particular truck has an aftermarket intake, so if you have the factory intake, it may look a little bit different. However, the steps and procedures are kind of the same. And of course, on this particular truck, the engine cover is missing. So the first thing you need to do is just remove the two 10mm bolts right here and lift up in the back, and that engine cover will come out of place. Then we can go ahead and remove the intake tube that's located right here. We need to remove the connector for the mass airflow sensor and tuck it out of the way. Next, we need to remove the PCV lines out of the way. On the factory intake, it's easiest just to remove the connections at the intake, but since this is an aftermarket intake, I'm just going to take the connections off at the valve covers and remove this whole piece using an 8mm socket. After that's complete, we can go ahead and remove the air hose that goes from the intake manifold to the PCV valve. These are just self-tightening hose clamps, so you can go ahead and take some pliers and remove those, and then twist, and this line will come right off. Now that that's out of the way, we can go ahead and start to take off some of the connectors that hang over this valve cover here. Starting with the fuel injector clips, just go ahead and depress down on the back of the connector and pull away, and we can remove all four fuel injector connectors. Now after that, we're going to go ahead and take the connector to our little evap purge valve here, and then there's a hose clamp on the back side of it, and we're going to remove the hose and this whole line out of the way. Next thing we need to do is remove all four connectors that go to our ignition coils. Same as the fuel injector connectors, we're just going to push down on the back of it and slowly wiggle them out. At the front of the valve cover, there's this metal bracket, and the wiring harness connects at this bracket in a few spots. I find it's easiest just to remove this bracket off of the front of the timing cover, rather than damaging the little hold downs for this bracket. Starting with this connector, we're going to go ahead and depress the back of it and remove it. Next, there is a ground towards the front of the valve cover right here. We're going to remove this 10mm bolt. It's super important that we put this ground back on because it's actually the ground for the ignition coils. If we go to start it up and that ground is connected, only 4 of the 8 cylinders will be firing. Next, we can take off the connector that goes to the throttle body. Now very carefully, let's take some needle nose pliers and we're gonna remove the wiring harness off of the front of the timing cover. Now there is one connector in the back and that actually goes to the O2 sensor. This one's not connected for some reason, but there is a little tab on the back of the valve cover that this bolts to. Go ahead and take some needle nose pliers and just depress these little tangs on the connector, and that connector will pop away from the valve cover itself. Now one of the last steps before we can get this wiring harness out of the way is to depress the little tangs off of the little clips on the wiring harness. There are about 2 or 3 locations on the valve cover itself where the wiring harness attaches to. I just depress that and it simply just pulls away. Once we have that kind of free, we can take this wiring harness and tie it out of the way. That way we can access the bolts that hold the valve cover down. Now that that mess is out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the 4 ignition coils that sit inside the valve cover. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to remove 4 screws, 1 for each coil, and then simply just slide the coil up and out. Alright, now before we remove anything, let's go ahead and just take an air gun here, and we're going to blow off the valve cover. That way any debris that we've created or any debris that's currently sitting on the valve cover doesn't get inside the motor. Alright, now we're ready to go ahead and remove all 12 bolts that hold the valve cover on using a 10mm socket. Alright, now that the bolts are removed, we can go ahead and remove our valve cover. You may have to get a flat blade screwdriver and just pry up on it a little bit, but it should come off fairly easy. Now one thing that's super important is that we get the mating surface of the gasket super clean. I'm just going to take some brake cleaner and a rag and go around just to make sure there's no oil or dirt or grease or anything like that that's going to cause a leak in the future. Before we go ahead and throw our new valve cover and gasket on, there's 2 areas that we really need to pay attention to. Right here and right down here. This is a cap that I'm pointing at right here that bolts down to the cylinder head. And they use like an RTV gasket sealer in this area and right down there to make sure that the gasket seals good. We're gonna have to clean this old gasket material off using a razor or a knife, and then just make sure that nothing drops in on the camshaft or into the cylinder head. We want to make sure that this area stays as clean as possible. Alright, now we can go ahead and throw our new valve cover and gasket back in. Now let's go ahead and throw all 12 bolts back in. I'm just going to get them hand tight because we're going to have to torque these down to a specific amount of torque, and I don't want to get them tight with my little power ratchet and possibly over torque the gasket. Alright, now that our bolts are hand tight, we're going to go ahead and torque them down using our inch-pound torque wrench right here in a 10mm socket. We're going to make 2 passes with the torque wrench, one at 18 inch-pounds, and then the second pass is going to be done at 73 inch-pounds. Now keep in mind, I am saying inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. If you torque these bolts down to 73 foot-pounds, you'll probably strip them. I'll go ahead and throw a link in the description for a diagram for which bolts to tighten when. Nissan actually does have a specific procedure as far as your tightening sequence. This is pretty handy. We definitely want to pay attention to this because we don't want any leaks once we go ahead and start it up and we have to take the valve cover off again. All right, once that's complete, we can go ahead and throw in our old coils and tighten down each bolt. All right, once our coils are in, we can go ahead and reinstall our wiring harness. What we're gonna do first is put the wiring harness little connectors back into the valve cover. And then here, it's pretty much reverse procedure, starting with this bracket here, and of course the very important ground cable. And our breather hose. So once you have your intake back on and your hose is all connected, double check your connections at your coils and your fuel injectors. You can go and put your negative battery cable back on and start it up. I hope this video helped you out. Check the link in the descriptions for the parts for good prices and everything like that, OEM quality parts. Thanks for watching as always, and see you guys next time.